In March, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 into law, following two earlier relief packages to help get our country through this pandemic. The American Rescue Plan has many of the same elements as previous packages, but also some important differences. Perhaps most important, it includes aid for state and local governments, including about $16.7 billion for the state of Texas. For now, let's focus on what the law means for education. In total, the law allocates about $125 billion for pre-K through 12 education and another $40 billion for colleges and universities. What does this mean for Texas? The American Rescue Plan includes significant funding for Texas schools through the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER 3 for short. As a reminder, the second relief package passed in December included ESSER 2 funds, of which Texas received $5.5 billion, but is not yet appropriated. Under this third larger package, ESSER 3, Texas is eligible for over $12.4 billion. The federal government has already started distributing these funds to states based on the share of funding they receive under Title I of the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, which is used to allocate federal dollars to students from low-income backgrounds. At minimum, 90% of these funds are to be passed through to local school districts based on their share of the state students from low-income backgrounds. The remaining 10% can be spent at the discretion of the Texas Education Agency. Unlike previous packages, though, ESSER 3 directs school districts to put at least 20% of these dollars towards learning recovery, and directs the Texas Education Agency to set aside at least half of its dollars for the same purpose. How does this funding address equity? The law also includes two critical fiscal policies. One is called maintenance of effort, and the other is called maintenance of equity. Both are meant to protect the most underserved students from disproportionately harmful cuts that have taken place in past recessions. So, in order for states to receive this federal funding, they have to do two things. First, maintain funding levels. Known as maintaining effort, this means that spending for pre-K through 12 education and higher education, calculated separately, have to represent at least the same share or proportion of total state spending over the next 2 years as they did on average in 2017, 18, and 19. Second, maintain equity. States have to make sure any cuts in state funding for 2022 and 23 for high-need school districts are less than any overall reduction in state funding across all districts in the state on a per-student basis. And for certain high-poverty districts, the state must provide at least as much state funding as it did in 2019. Again, this policy is intended to reduce harm to the most vulnerable Texas students. What about higher education? The Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, or HERE 3 for short, consists of nearly $40 billion in federal funding, of which Texas colleges and universities will receive roughly $3 billion. This follows the same formula as the previous HERE 2 funds, of which Texas institutions received around a total of $1.8 billion. Colleges and universities that receive funds are required to spend at least the same amount on emergency grants to students as they did with funds allocated by the previous relief packages. So while the amount varies by institution, of that nearly $3 billion in HERE 3 funds coming to Texas institutions, about half of that, or $1.4 billion, must be used for direct emergency student aid. What does all this mean? Texas is fortunate to have access to this important federal funding. It's now up to state lawmakers to allocate the funding appropriately in a way that balances lots of demands. First, timing. District leaders are seeking clarity and must urgently budget, plan, and respond to these unprecedented disruptions to student learning over the past year. Second, equity. Not all students have been impacted equally by this pandemic, so resources need to be distributed fairly to support Texas students who have been hit the hardest during this pandemic. Third, flexibility. Across our large and diverse state, local communities have different resources, different needs, and important knowledge about how to effectively serve their students. Finally, accountability. We all have an interest in making sure that these dollars are used effectively and lead to the best outcomes possible for our 5.4 million Texas students. State and local leaders can contact the Education Trust in Texas to get more details about what this federal funding means for their communities. As always, follow the Education Trust in Texas as things develop, and reach out anytime if there's district level data or any other information that we can provide.